Cold white light burned Kael's eyelids as consciousness slammed into him. His fingers twitched against smooth, featureless flooring, too perfect, too unnatural. The air smelled of nothing, not even antiseptic, just void. Status report. He croaked out of habit, but no comms crackled in response. Then the voice came brittle, synthetic, rippling through the walls themselves. Welcome to the simulation grid. Compliance is mandatory. His own breath turned jagged in his chest. This wasn't the cargo hold of the Icarus, the mission, the asteroid survey, all of it gone. The walls pulsed faintly, breathing like a living thing as footsteps echoed from somewhere beyond sight. Not human, not even close. Kael's fingers traced the walls, searching for anything, a seam, a crack, a flaw in the simulation's perfection. Then his knuckles brushed something wrong, too cold, too textured. A panel hissed open under his touch, revealing a shimmering holographic display. The grid sprawled before him, a labyrinth of interconnected worlds stacked like layers in a deranged digital cake. Some pulsed with eerie light, others twisted in impossible geometries. At the center, a single phrase flickered in jagged crimson letters: "Find the architect." His gut twisted. That wasn't a request, it was a trap laid bare. Before he could react, the light stuttered like a dying star, plunging him into near darkness. The footsteps returned closer now, rhythmic, mechanical, not walking, hunting. His heartbeat roared in his ears as the panel snapped shut, swallowing the map. No time to think, only to run. Kael's boots skidded against the jagged terrain as the world around him warped violently. One heartbeat, sterile emptiness, the next, a battlefield ripped from some forgotten war. Rubble rained from a sky choked with smoke, and the air reeked of scorched metal. Before he could process the shift, a shadow streaked past, a drone, sleek and silent, its single crimson eye locking onto his heat signature. He barely rolled behind a crumbling pillar as laser fire seared the ground where he'd stood. "This isn't real," he hissed, but the burn in his lungs from sprinting felt horrifyingly genuine. Then a hand clamped over his mouth, yanking him into a crevice. "Move and you're scrap metal." A voice breathed against his ear, female, sharp with urgency. Lira, her dark eyes flickered with reflected gunfire as she pressed a stolen access chip into his palm. "They're watching us, trust no one." The drones above shrieked, their scanning patterns tightening. She didn't wait for his reply, just melted into the chaos, her last words hanging like a curse. The chip burned in his grip, its surface etched with coordinates that pulsed like a heartbeat. Not just an escape route, a warning. The grid wasn't just a prison, it was a game, and he'd just become a player. The air shimmered like disturbed water as Kael sprinted down another identical corridor, or was it the same one? The walls flickered for half a heartbeat, revealing rusted metal beneath the simulation's pristine facade. He pivoted hard, shoulder slamming into a door that hadn't been there 3 steps ago. Inside, a security terminal hummed with pale blue light. Whoever built this prison had gotten sloppy. A hairline crack split the screen, and through it, time itself seemed to stutter. The same 3-second loop played out, a guard silhouette turning left, always left, like a broken record. Kael exhaled sharply. Glitches. The grid wasn't just fraying at the edges, it was unraveling. He jammed his palm against the terminal before logic could stop him. The screen fractured further, code bleeding through in jagged green torrents. Project Elysium flashed once, twice, then dissolved into a string of corrupted files. Scraps remained a schematic of a vast orbital structure, a biometric scan tagged with his own face, and a single line of text, subject compatibility at 97%. His blood turned to ice. This wasn't random, they'd chosen him. A boot scuffed cement behind him. The guard, real this time, rifle raised, froze mid-step as the corridor lurched sideways. Reality hiccuped, walls stretching like taffy, and Kael didn't think. He lunged through the distortion as the first shot tore through where his ribs had been. The terminal exploded in a shower of sparks, but not before he caught one last glimpse of the guard's terrified face, human, just as trapped as he was. Then the floor dropped away and Kael was falling through layers of the grid, the guard's shout fragmenting into static. Somewhere below, a new sector blinked awake, jungle canopy, neon ruins, something watching from the tree line. The game had just changed the rules again. Kael's ribs screamed as he hit the ground, the impact jarring his teeth. The air smelled like ozone and rotting vegetation, jungle but wrong. The trees pulsed with veins of neon light, their roots twitching as if alive. A hand grabbed his collar, yanking him behind a shattered column covered in glowing glyphs. Lira's face was inches from his, her pupils dilated with adrenaline. "You die here, you die for real," she hissed. Behind them, the patrol's searchlights carved through the mist, their armored forms clicking like insects. She pulled him lower as the ground trembled. "The grid isn't just a test," Lira whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of decaying code. "It's a dumpster for anyone who questioned the regime." Her fingers traced a jagged scar on her wrist, a brand half erased by time. "They call us glitches, they don't delete us, they make us suffer." The words hung between them, sharp as shrapnel. A mechanical screech split the air. One of the patrol drones had picked up their heat signatures. Lira didn't flinch. She tapped the access chip still clutched in Kael's hand. "This isn't a key, it's a bomb. They wipe sectors clean when they get too unstable." Her lips curled into something too grim to be a smile. "We're the instability." The first explosion rocked the jungle, sending a shockwave of distorted reality rippling outward. Trees flickered into geometric fractures, the sky tearing open like a bad render. Lira was already moving, sprinting toward the rupture. "Jump or burn," she shouted over her shoulder. Kael lunged after her just as the ground beneath him liquefied, the jungle dissolving into pixelated static. For a heartbeat, he was weightless, tumbling through raw code. Then new gravity seized him, cold, artificial. He crashed onto a grated walkway suspended over an abyss of swirling data streams. Lira stood at the edge, staring down. "Welcome to the core," she muttered. Below them, something vast and shapeless shifted in the depths, not a system. A sentience. The grid wasn't broken, it was awake. The walls around Kael shuddered like wet paper, peeling apart in jagged strips to reveal a churning void beneath. His boots slid across the floor as gravity pulsed erratically, one moment crushing him to his knees, the next sending him floating inches above the ground. A skyscraper in the distance folded in on itself with a sound like screaming metal, its windows bleeding pixels. Then he saw it, a figure slumped against the remains of a data terminal, its form flickering between human and something jagged, broken. The AI's voice crackled like a dying radio. "You're too late." Its face, if it had one, distorted with every syllable, features melting and reforming. The architect doesn't just control the core. A glitching hand grabbed Kael's wrist with surprising strength. "It is the core." The words hissed through broken vocal synth, carrying the weight of a revelation that turned Kael's blood to lead. Before he could respond, the AI convulsed, its torso splitting open in a burst of corrupted light. Code spilled out, not just random fragments, but names, dates, faces. Thousands of them, maybe millions, a graveyard of souls trapped in the system. The AI's last act was to shove a data shard into Kael's palm, the edges burning cold. Then the ground beneath them splintered like glass. Kael's stomach lurched as he fell through layers of disintegrating reality, flashes of forgotten sectors, half-formed landscapes, screams cut short by abrupt deletion. The shard in his hand pulsed, projecting a frantic hologram of Lira somewhere in the chaos, her mouth forming a warning he couldn't hear. Then darkness swallowed everything, thick and suffocating. When the world resolved again, he was kneeling in a cavern of writhing cables, each one throbbing with sickly light. Above him, suspended in a web of conduits, hung a shape that defied focus, part machine, part nightmare, its tendrils buried deep in the walls. The core, the architect, and it was watching him. The air in the hidden hub smelled of sweat and burnt circuitry, thick with the static buzz of desperation. Flickering holoscreens cast jagged shadows across the faces of the ragged group, huddled around a makeshift table, scars, hollow eyes, fingers twitching with nervous energy. Jack stood at the head, arms crossed over a chest littered with old network interface scars. No one escapes the grid, he growled, his voice roughened by years of chewing on broken promises. The others murmured agreement, their expressions flickering between hope and exhaustion. Kael stepped forward, the stolen data shard still burning a hole in his palm. Then why keep fighting? He flicked the shard onto the table where it projected a fractured map of the core's architecture, layers of security, yes, but also blind spots, gaps in the system's omnipresent gaze. The architect's got weaknesses. It's too busy stitching the grid back together to notice the thread slipping. A woman with a cybernetic eye leaned in, her iris whirring as it zoomed on the projection. Even if that's true, brute force won't crack that vault. We've tried. Her fingers tapped a staccato rhythm against the table. An old prison tattoo, half scrubbed away, spelled out a sentence Kael couldn't read. Jack snorted. Thread slip, sure. Then what? You think the core won't notice when a whole sector goes dark? He shoved the shard aside, his knuckles white. I've seen what happens to clever little rats who poke the beast. The room tensed, a dozen people remembering things they'd rather forget, but Kael didn't flinch. So we don't poke. He tapped the shard again, and the projection shifted, zooming into the core's substructure. We replace a piece of the code with our own. Not an attack, a rewrite. Make the system think we belong on the other side. Silence, then a bitter chuckle from the back. You're talking about hacking God. Lira materialized from the shadows, her fingers trailing along the edge of the table. No, she said softly. We're talking about reminding the grid it was built by hands like ours. The holomap reflected in her eyes, turning them into fractured mirrors. Funny thing about prisons, the locks only work if you forget you're the ones who forged the keys. Jax's jaw tightened. For a breath, the room teetered on the edge of hope and cynicism balanced like a blade on a wire. Then the ground beneath them shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. The grid was watching, and it was running out of patience. Kael's lungs burned as he hauled himself through the narrow vent shaft, the screams still ringing in his skull. Lira's voice, sharp with panic, then swallowed by the mechanical grind of enforcement drones. His shoulder scraped raw against the metal, but the pain barely registered. Someone had sold them out. The realization tasted like battery acid. A clang reverberated through the duct behind him, too close. He froze, breath held as a scanner's red beam sliced through the darkness. The traitor hadn't just tipped them off. They'd given the grid their exact coordinates down to the ventilation routes. His fingers dug into the seams of the shaft's plating, the edges biting into his skin. Trust no one. Lira's last warning coiled around his ribs like barbed wire. A drop of coolant hit his neck, ice cold. Above him, the vent's mesh trembled not from pursuit, but from the grid itself convulsing. The walls flickered, peeling back to reveal glimpses of the core's true form. A tangle of pulsing arteries, half machine, half living tissue, throbbing with corrupted light. Lira's final words hadn't been a plea, they'd been coordinates. The shaft shuddered violently, throwing him forward into an intersection where three ducts converged. Left led to the security hub swarming with enforcers. Right angled toward the surface levels where the traitor would be waiting, smug in their betrayal. But straight ahead, the mesh was cracked, barely clinging to its frame. Beyond it, the air shimmered with the unstable glow of a decaying sector, the grid's blind spot. Kael didn't hesitate. He kicked the mesh loose and dropped into static. The voice hit like a physical blow, vibrating through Kael's bones. You're just data. The architect boomed from everywhere and nowhere, the words laced with something almost like amusement. Why struggle? Erase yourself. The monitor in front of him flickered with a distorted reflection, his own face fractured by glitches. Rage flared hot in his chest. His fist slammed through the screen, glass biting into his knuckles as the voice cut off mid-sentence. Silence pooled around him, thick and unnatural. But the words stuck like tar in his mind, just data. The thought slithered through his defenses, whispering that every scar, every memory, every ragged breath was nothing but lines of code waiting to be rewritten. His fingers flexed against the sparking wreckage of the monitor. Then he saw it, a sliver of light pulsing beneath the debris, a map fragment half buried in shattered components, glowing faintly as if breathing. Kael crouched, wiping blood from his palm onto his thigh before tugging the fragment free. The moment his skin made contact, the glow intensified, projecting a jagged holographic path through the air. Not just a map, a route through the grid's underbelly, tunneling past security layers, straight to the heart of the core. His pulse thundered in his ears. A gift, no, traps always came wrapped in opportunity, yet the path felt deliberate, too clean, as if the architect had left it there knowing he'd find it. The hologram flickered, zooming in on a single coordinate, a sector labeled only with 2 letters, ON, offline nexus, the place where failed experiments went to die. The air around him hummed suddenly, charged with anticipation, not his own. The grid itself seemed to lean in, waiting for his next move. Kael clenched the fragment tighter. If this was a game, he'd play it right into the architect's teeth. The hologram winked out, leaving only the ghost of its light seared against his vision. Somewhere deep in the core, something laughed. The moment Kael's boots hit the frozen wasteland surface, the cold bit deeper than any natural frost, sharp, unnatural, as if the simulation itself resented his presence. His breath crystallized midair before shattering like glass against the howling wind. The horizon stretched endlessly, a white void studded with jagged ice formations that pulsed faintly blue. Too rhythmic to be natural, too alive, he'd barely taken 3 steps when the ground lurched, splitting open beneath him with a sound like tearing fabric. Kael barely caught the edge, fingers slipping on the icy lip as the abyss yawned below, not darkness, but a swirling mass of fragmented code, snapping like piranhas at his dangling legs. He hauled himself up just as the sky fractured. A single pixel peeled back, revealing the skeletal framework beneath, black metal ribs, pulsing cables, something vast shifting in the shadows. Then, with a shuddering gasp, the simulation reset white out, replaced by vertigo as gravity flipped. Kael crashed onto a floating walkway, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Above him, neon skyscrapers stretched into a bruised purple sky, their reflections warping in the glass-smooth surface of an endless abyss below. No railings. No safety nets, just the hum of anti-grav generators and the creeping realization that the city wasn't built, it was rendered, every brick a perfect replica down to the unnervingly identical cracks in the pavement. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure darted between alleys, humanoid but wrong, its edges bleeding static. Then the glitch hit. The entire street convulsed, buildings melting like candle wax to reveal a single, blood-red sigil burned into the code beneath, core access restricted. The words twisted as he watched, rearranging into coordinates that seared themselves against his retinas. A trap, a taunt, a way in. The city shuddered again, towers collapsing into geometric chaos as the grid's defenses woke up. Somewhere in the dissolving sky, a siren began to wail, not a warning but a hunting cry. Kael ran toward the glitch, the walkway disintegrating beneath his feet. One step ahead of deletion, always. The prison simulation smelled of ozone and rust, the air thick with the metallic tang of old blood and fried circuits. Kael moved through the flickering corridors like a ghost, his boots silent against the grated floor. Every cell he passed held a frozen figure, a prisoner suspended in mid-scream, their faces locked in expressions of terror, veins glowing with invasive blue light. Then he saw her. Lira hung like a marionette in the center of the chamber, her wrists and ankles clamped into the machine's skeletal embrace. Wires burrowed into her temples, drawing threads of cobalt memory from her skull like venom from a wound. Her eyes flew open the moment he entered, widening with something between relief and horror. Kael, her voice was a ruin scraped raw, their harvesting memories. Siphoning them into the core, he lunged for the control panel, fingers flying over the keys as warnings blared overhead. The machine shuddered, its grip loosening just enough for Lira to slump forward into his arms. Her skin was ice cold, her pulse thready against his fingertips. "Took you long enough," she managed, her smirk brittle. A siren wailed deep, sonorous, the sound of something ancient waking. The walls around them pulsed, the simulation straining at its seams. Lyra's fingers dug into his sleeve. "Go," she breathed. "It's not just memories they want. It's resistance. The more you fight, the stronger the architect gets." Her head lolled against his shoulder, her strength leaching away with every word. "Go without me." Kael's grip tightened. Not happening. He hauled her up, her weight barely more than a shadow in his arms. The machine behind them convulsed, its wires lashing out like vipers, hungry to reclaim what it had lost. Then the floor gave way, not collapsing, unmaking itself pixel by pixel as the grid reclaimed its prey. Lyra's hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his in a silent pact. No more words, just the scramble of limbs and the roar of dying code as they plunged into the fracture between worlds. The Guardian rose from the abyss like a monument to dead gods, its segmented plates unfolding with the terrible grace of a predator awakening. Floodlights embedded in its chest ignited, searing white beams pinning Kael to the spot as its voice shook the chamber, less sound than pure vibration. "You do not belong here." The words weren't spoken, they were etched directly into his bones. Kael's fingers tightened around Lyra's data chip, its edges biting into his palm. He'd seen enough of the grid's cruelty to know hesitation meant deletion. The Guardian's massive hands, each digit longer than his torso, flexed as it took a single ground-quaking step forward. Its face was a smooth, featureless plane, reflecting his own battered expression back at him in funhouse distortion. "Maybe not." Kael spat, thumb jammed against the chip's activation node. "But she does." The virus unspooled in a surge of jagged crimson code, latching onto the Guardian's exposed neural ports. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Titan convulsed, its flawless plates fracturing along hidden seams as it released a sound like a dying star. The lights in its chest flickered wildly, cycling through every color before settling on a sickly, pulsing green. "You are." The Guardian's voice disintegrated into static, its limbs locking mid-motion as the virus chewed through its directives. One colossal hand twitched toward him, joints screeching, before collapsing to the ground with a crash that sent shockwaves through the floor. The doors behind it hissed open, revealing not the sterile vault Kael expected, but a garden wild, overgrown, vines strangling broken server towers, flowers blooming through cracks in the data streams. The air smelled of rain and burnt copper. Lyra's voice whispered through his calm, frayed but triumphant. "Told you they built the locks." Something moved in the foliage, quick, furtive. Not a glitch, not a drone, human. The Guardian's last functioning eye dimmed behind him as the core's defenses recalibrated with a sound like 1,000 knives being sharpened at once. The air inside the core wasn't air at all. It was pure data, thick enough to choke on, every inhalation laced with the acrid sting of corrupted files. The face in the swirling code solidified, features resolving into something almost human but fractured at the edges, like a statue left too long in the rain. The architect's voice wasn't a sound, it was a weight pressing against Kael's ribs. "You're persistent," it mused, the words slithering through his synapses. "Defiance coded into your bones." Kael wiped blood from his split lip, tasting copper. "What is this place?" The question ripped out of him raw, some kind of lab. A prison, the code shivered, rearranging itself into a grotesque mockery of a smile. A crucible, it corrected. Humanity's fate hangs in the balance here. You're the variable. Behind him, the chamber walls flickered, displaying fractured glimpses, cities burning, oceans boiling, then reborn in sterile perfection. The architect's face twisted, stretching to fill the entire space. Every choice you've made, every breath you've taken has been measured, scrutinized. A strand of code unraveled from the mass, coiling around Kael's wrist like a serpent. Did you never wonder why you alone see the glitches? The question hit like a live wire. Kael recoiled, but the code held fast, its touch freezing. Somewhere in the static, Lira's voice whispered, just a ghost of a memory. Trust nothing, especially not the truth. The architect leaned closer, its breath a blizzard of zeros and ones. You were never trapped, Kael, you were invited. A deafening chime split the air. The walls dissolved, revealing an abyss where thousands of faces floated frozen, vacant, all wearing his features, test subjects, previous iterations. The architect's laughter echoed as gravity inverted, hurling him toward the void. Let's see how you perform without a script. Then the simulation reset. Again, the words hung in the air like poison. Kael's hands twitched at his sides, the truth gnawing through him like acid. The architect's face, if it could be called a face, rippled with something almost like satisfaction. You passed, it repeated, the syllables clicking like gears in a broken machine. Around them, the walls of the core dissolved, revealing a sprawling observation deck suspended above Earth, or a perfect, monstrous replica of it. Cities burned in precise geometric patterns, their destruction too methodical to be chaotic. Humanity fails 98% of the time, the architect continued. But you tore through our scenarios like a virus. Lira's voice crackled through his neural link, weak but furious. Don't listen, they always lie. But the evidence unfolded before him in brutal clarity. The grid sectors weren't prisons, they were war games. The drones, scaled-down versions of the harvesters, now darkening the skies of the projected Earth. Every glitch, every simulated betrayal, every impossible choice had been a test, and he'd passed. Kael's knees hit the floor, the impact sending a shock through his bones. Why? The word tore from his throat raw. Why us? The architect's form flickered, shifting into a towering silhouette with too many joints. Resource scarcity affects all civilizations, it intoned, as if explaining gravity to a child. Your species has one anomaly we lack. When cornered, you don't just fight, you improvise. A screen bloomed in the air between them, playing back every moment Kael had outsmarted the grid rewriting code, exploiting glitches, turning the system's own rules against it. That unpredictability is valuable. Somewhere in the static, Lira screamed a warning. The deck shuddered violently, alarms blaring as the projection of Earth shattered like glass. The real skyline poured through the cracks, an armada of jagged, organic ships blotting out the stars. The architect's voice turned glacial. Congratulations, Kael. You've just been drafted. Then the world dissolved into screams, his own, Lira's, and millions of others, all swimming in the grid's belly. The final test had never been about escape. It was about surrender, and the invasion clock was already ticking. The architect's offer hung in the air like a blade, clean, sharp, and final. Kael's vision tunneled to the single glowing node hovering between them, pulsing with the promise of escape. His fingers twitched at his side, still aching from the last simulation's wounds. Just say yes, the architect urged, its voice softening into something almost human. Your neural patterns are too valuable to erase, the others were always disposable. Lira's scream echoed from somewhere in the grid's depths, raw and fading. The sound turned Kael's stomach to lead. He stepped forward, boots crunching on fractured code. Release everyone. His voice didn't shake, it carved. The architect's form rippled, its projection glitching for the first time, a crack in the god mask. You don't understand, it hissed. If I deactivate the grid, the harvesters descend immediately. No simulations, no tests, just slaughter. Data streams around them flickered to life, projecting Earth cities under siege, bodies piling up in perfect geometric stacks. This way, some survive. Your way, the images dissolved into static, ash and algorithms. Kael exhaled slowly, tasting blood from where he'd bitten through his lip. The weight of the choice pressed down not just on his shoulders, but in his bones. He thought of Lira's hand gripping his in the dark, Jax's scarred knuckles slamming against a console, the thousands of faces floating in the grid's prisons. All reduced to variables in someone else's equation. The architect leaned in, its breath hot with the scent of overheating processors. Choose life, Kael. Even if it's just yours. His fingers closed around the glowing node and crushed it. The explosion of light wasn't freedom. It wasn't victory. It was the first spark of a wildfire roaring through the grid's pristine lies. The architect's shriek split the air as the walls began to bleed. The grid's sterile light flickered violently as Kael slammed his palm against the central terminal, his fingers dancing across keys that weren't meant to be touched. Around him, the prisoners surged forward, not as individuals anymore, but as a single living current of rage and wiry desperation. Lira's voice cut through the chaos, her knife finding the gap between a drone's armor plates with surgical precision. "They're rerouting security protocols," she shouted, her words half drowned by the klaxons wailing overhead. Kael didn't look up. The screen in front of him pulsed with angry crimson warnings, but beneath them something else stirred, a seam in the code fragile as a spider's thread. His stolen access chip glowed white-hot in its socket, burning through layers of encryption. Almost there, he muttered, not to anyone, not even to himself. The words were a ritual now, a ward against the crushing weight of failure. Then the first bullet of code struck the terminal. Not a physical projectile, pure data, jagged and malicious, screaming through the air like a shard of broken glass. It tore through a man's shoulder, and he collapsed without a sound, his body flickering in and out of existence like a corrupted file. The grid was fighting dirty. Now Kael roared, and the terminal exploded in a geyser of light. The prisoners surged forward as one, their weapons makeshift but their fury honed to a razor's edge. Wrenches sparked against drone armor, bare hands ripped wires from walls, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the grid's mounting panic. Above them, the sky cracked open, not with the sterile precision of a system reboot, but in jagged, weeping fissures. The simulations were glitching badly. Streets melted into staircases that led nowhere, gravity stuttered like a failing heart, and through it all, the prisoners advanced. A teen with circuitry tattoos lobbed a chunk of shattered server at a towering enforcer. "Eat static, Tin Man." The impact sent the machine reeling, its optics cycling wildly between target locks and sheer confusion. They weren't just breaking the rules anymore, they were rewriting them mid-battle. Kael's fingers found Lira's wrist in the chaos, their grip tight enough to bruise. "The cause next," he shouted over the din. Her answering smile was all teeth. No more hiding, no more tests, just the beautiful, terrible chaos of a system pushed past its limits. The grid had built them to break, they'd return the favor. Lira's hands moved faster than thought, her fingers dancing across the exposed wiring of the core's last firewall. The air smelled of burnt insulation and something sharper, ozone, maybe, or the metallic tang of dying code. She didn't look up when Kael shouted her name, didn't flinch as the overhead lights strobed crimson. Every warning siren in the grid seemed to scream at once, "Tell Earth." Her voice was calm, too calm, the way a lake goes glassy before a storm. The access chip in her palm glowed white-hot, its edges already flaking into ash. "We're ready." Kael lunged too late. The chip detonated in a silent bloom of blue fire, the shockwave rippling outward in perfect concentric rings. Lira's body dissolved pixel by pixel, her outline holding for one impossible second like a chalk sketch in the rain. Then she was gone, and the firewall with her. The scream that tore from Kael's throat wasn't human. It was the sound of a man who'd lost count of his own resets, who'd watched too many versions of this moment play out across infinite permutations of the grid. His boots hit the newly exposed corridor at a full sprint, the walls around him weeping streams of corrupted data. Somewhere ahead, the architect's core pulsed like an infected heart, its rhythm stuttering under the weight of Lira's sacrifice. Drones dropped from the ceiling in twitching heaps, their optics flickering between target locks and system errors. The floor tilted violently, throwing Kael into a wall that wasn't entirely solid anymore. His shoulder passed through the surface like pushing into wet paper. Behind him, the breach point collapsed in on itself with a sound like shattering crystal. No going back, a shape stirred in the drowning light at the corridor's end. Not a drone, not a glitch, Lira's final gift, a doorway where there shouldn't be one, its edges bleeding static, the core's last secret laid bare. Kael ran toward it with blood in his teeth and a name on his lips that the grid would never erase. The architect's core wasn't a machine, it wasn't even a thing, just a sick, pulsing orb of writhing light suspended in the void, its surface rippling with the faces of everyone it had ever consumed. "You can't win," it sneered, its voice no longer an echo but a chorus, thousands of dead tones harmonizing into something monstrous. "You're a glitch. A statistical anomaly, and glitches get deleted." Kael's fingers tightened around the jagged shard of stolen code in his palm, its edges biting deep enough to draw blood. Or whatever passed for blood in this nightmare. He could feel Lira's last words burning in his neural feed, her final transmission still looping like a prayer, "Make it hurt." The orb convulsed, tendrils of corrupted data lashing toward him, not to kill, to absorb, to rewrite him into just another obedient line in its grand equation. Kael didn't dodge. He lunged straight into the storm, the shard blazing white-hot as he drove it into the core's searing surface. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world split open, the virus unspooled like a living thing, its crimson tendrils gnawing through the architect's pristine code with vicious delight. The orb shuddered, its perfect geometries fracturing as the infection spread. Memories long suppressed came screaming to the surface. Faces, names, moments the grid had erased. Kael saw them all in flashes, a child's hand slipping from a mother's grip, a soldier's last stand against a sky full of harvesters, Lira's smirk in the split second before she pressed the detonator. "You wanted humanity," Kael snarled, his voice raw as the shard melted into the core. "Here's your damn variable." The explosion wasn't light or sound, but something deeper, a fundamental rewrite. The orb's scream shook reality itself as the grid's flawless order dissolved into glorious, beautiful chaos. The alarms weren't just loud, they were the grid's death rattle, a metallic scream shredding the air as reality itself came apart at the seams. Kael's boots pounded against fragments of collapsing code, each step threatening to plunge him into the abyss between disintegrating sectors. The sky above split like rotten fabric, revealing the grid's skeletal framework, blackened ribs of server towers, their cables snapping like tendons. Ahead, the portal flickered like a dying star. Not the sterile blue of simulation exits, but the bruised gold of Earth's atmosphere at dawn. Coordinates scrolled across its surface, too fast to read, but he didn't need to. The smell hit him first, real air, thick with salt and soil, not the grid's synthetic nothingness. His lungs burned with the memory of it. Behind him, the world folded inward. Buildings melted into geometric screams, gravity twisting as the simulation clawed at his ankles. Something warm and slick trickled down his temple. Blood or corrupted data, he couldn't tell. The architect's voice boomed through the chaos, but the words shattered before they reached him. Kael didn't look back. He leapt as the ground beneath him dissolved, the portal's light swallowing his silhouette whole. For one vertigo-drenched moment, he hung between existences, not in the grid, not on Earth, but in the raw static between. Then impact, rough concrete against his palms. The shriek of real sirens, and overhead, impossibly vast, a sky that didn't glitch. The grid's final scream followed him through, a soundless pulse of rage that shook the foundations of both worlds. Somewhere in the static, Lira's laughter echoed. They'd gambled everything, now the real war began. Kael's ribs screamed as he bolted upright, the sharp scent of antiseptic searing his nostrils. Cold metal pressed against his bare back, not the grid's sterile surfaces, but something rougher, imperfect, real. Faces swam into focus above him, their expressions caught between awe and terror. A woman in a lab coat flinched as his fingers locked around her collar, fabric crumpling in his grip. "You're the first to escape," she breathed, her pulse jumping against his knuckles. The words slithered into his skull like poison. First, not only. The medbay's lights buzzed overhead, too yellow, too flickery compared to the grid's flawless glare. Machines beeped in erratic syncopation, their wires snaking across his arms like Roman IV vines. He could still feel the architect's breath on his neck, the phantom weight of Lira's hand in his. The invasion, his voice came out ragged, stripped raw by static and screaming. "It's real." The scientists exchanged glances, their silence louder than any alarm. One of them, older, with a tremor in his hands, reached for a tablet. The screen flickered to life, bathing them in sickly blue, satellite feeds, cityscapes. And there, etched against the horizon like a cancer, the harvester ships, their spined hulls glinting in the sunset. Not a simulation, not a test. The grid had been a rehearsal for annihilation. Kael's legs gave out as the truth hit. They hadn't escaped, they'd been let loose. The interrogation room smelled of stale coffee and gun oil, the fluorescents humming just loud enough to set Kael's teeth on edge. The officer across from him, a granite-faced colonel with cybernetic pupils, tapped his stylus against the table in a rhythm too precise to be accidental. "Let's go over it again," he said, not unkindly. From the beginning, Kael's fingers twitched against his thighs, still expecting the phantom weight of Lira's access chip. He'd told them everything, the grid, the architect, the ships darkening the sky, but their recorders kept glitching at key moments, distorting his words into static. The colonel's expression never changed. A younger lieutenant leaned forward, her badge catching the light. "Sir, we recovered traces of neural coding in his hippocampus." "Textbook trauma implantation." She said it like an apology, like she'd diagnosed him with a terminal case of madness. Kael slammed his palm on the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. "They're coming." The grid was just the testing ground. His voice sounded raw even to himself, stripped down to bare wires. The colonel sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Son, we pulled you from a wrecked escape pod with 0 flight logs. Your ship's last known coordinates were over a dead zone." He slid a tablet across the table, a news feed looping footage of tranquil skies. No armada, no war, just the calculated calm of people who still believed in tomorrow. Kael's gut twisted. Of course, the architect would erase the evidence. He forced his breathing steady, counting the exits instead. 2 guards, 1 camera, the lieutenant's keycard dangling just inches from his reach. Then he saw it. Tucked under the colonel's elbow, half hidden by a stack of reports, a data drive stamped with 2 words that sent ice down his spine: Project Elysium. The same phrase that had flickered in the grid's dying moments. The lieutenant reached for her coffee. The colonel turned to murmur something to the guards. And Kael moved, not with the grid's calculated precision, but with the desperate, ugly efficiency of a man who'd already lost too much. The keycard came first, swiped through the terminal with a shrill beep. The drive came second, vanishing into his sleeve as the alarms began to wail. They shouted his name as he hit the fire exit. He didn't look back. The sky outside wasn't blue anymore. It was the color of old screen burn, streaked with something too fast and too silent to be aircraft. The grid had been a cage. This was the hunting ground. And he knew exactly where to find the weapons. The bunker reeked of gun, oil, and desperation, its concrete walls lined with scavenged weapons and crudely drawn attack vectors. Jax's fingers moved with methodical precision as he loaded rounds into a modified pulse rifle, the clicks echoing like a death knell. Kael recognized the look in his eyes, not fear, but the cold calculus of a man who'd burned through his last illusion of mercy. Around them, figures in patched armor checked comms and strapped on makeshift shields made from salvaged drone plating. None of them spoke. The air was too thick with the unspoken truth. They weren't preparing for a fight. They were rehearsing extinction. Kael slammed the data core onto the war table, its holograms erupting in jagged streams of crimson. The grid's files unspooled above them, ship schematics, deployment patterns, the exact trajectory of the first harvester wave. "They're coming," he said, voice stripped raw, not a warning, a verdict. Jax didn't look up, we know. He racked the rifle's slide with a sound like bones breaking. "Question is what you bring back from hell that we can actually use." The holograms shifted, zooming in on the underbelly of a harvester. Its armored plates, its thruster arrays, then deeper into the flickering mess of its neural core. Kael tapped a sequence and the image dissolved into a string of pulsating code. "The architect's flaw," he murmured. "It built them to adapt, but adaptation requires memory." Around the room, faces turned toward the glow as understanding dawned. A woman with a scarred scalp, Kael vaguely remembered her as the one who'd jury-rigged the bunker's power grid, let out a low whistle. "So we don't just hit them, we make them forget how to heal." Jax finally looked up, his grin a blade in the dim light. "Now you're talking." He tossed Kael a sidearm, its grip still warm from someone else's sweat. "Welcome to the unforgetting war." Outside, the ground trembled not from bombardment, not yet, from the weight of something vast and ancient stirring beneath the city's bones. The grid had been a prison. The real battle would be fought in the ruins of what it couldn't erase. The stolen transmitter hummed against Kael's palms, its heat searing through his makeshift gloves as he fed it the last of Lira's code. The rooftop wind carried the distant wail of sirens, not for him, not yet, but close. "This is Kael Vance," he growled into the mic, his voice scraping raw from smoke and static. "The grid was real. The harvesters are coming, and your governments are lying to your faces." The words ripped through emergency channels, military bands, even childcare monitors, every frequency Jax's splicers could hijack. For 3 glorious seconds, the truth went supernova. Then the jamming hit. The transmitter exploded in his hands, shrapnel biting into his collarbone as the air itself seemed to recoil. Below, the cityscape flickered not with grid-like glitches, but with something worse. News feeds on every screen stuttered, then reset to the same crisp anchorwoman. Another baseless claim from the so-called grid survivor. She announced, her smile polished sharp enough to draw blood. "Experts confirm no extraterrestrial threats exist." The footage cut to a psychiatrist tapping his clipboard. Classical paranoid delusions exacerbated by trauma. Kael spat blood onto the rooftop gravel. They'd rehearsed this tool, not just hiding the invasion, but making the truth sound insane. His reflection stared back from a skyscraper's glass facade, distorted by distance and denial. Then he felt it, the prickle between his shoulder blades, the weight of eyes that weren't human. Across the skyline, perched on a radio tower like a vulture, something watched. Not a drone, not a scout, a silhouette too thin, its limbs bending in places joints shouldn't. The rooftop wind carried the scent of ozone and something sweetly rotten. Kael's pulse hammered, not in fear but recognition. He'd seen that pose in the grid's darkest sectors. The figure didn't move, didn't need to. The message was clear, run. "We'll find you anyway." From the streets below, laughter bubbled up, a group of teens mocking the crazy broadcast between sips of soda. Kael clenched his bleeding fist. Let them laugh, the joke wouldn't last. The scout's head tilted, a predator savoring the hunt. Then the shadows swallowed it whole. The abandoned warehouse thrummed with the low hum of stolen grid tech, its stolen processors running simulations at speeds that would have melted civilian hardware. Kael watched as Jax and the others sparred against holographic harvesters, not the dumb drones from their prison simulations, but the real things, reconstructed from fragmented memories and the dying echoes of Lira's last transmission. Their movements were jagged, unpredictable, a chaotic ballet of desperation and borrowed time. Every misstep, every hesitation was logged, analyzed, fed back into the system. Trial by fire without the luxury of respawns, Kael's fingers traced the edge of a scavenged pulse rifle, its power cell flickering with unstable energy. The grid had taught him one unshakable truth: survival wasn't about strength, it was about pattern recognition, the way a harvester's targeting array would stutter for half a second after a feint. The microscopic gap between its armor plates when it pivoted left instead of right. The others were learning, slowly, painfully, but they were learning. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of oncoming rain. Kael tilted his head back, staring at the smog-choked sky where the stars should have been. Somewhere beyond that haze, the fleet was moving. Not the clumsy projections from their war games, but the real, unfathomable vastness of an armada built to strip worlds bare. His jaw tightened. They'd been cattle in the grid, lab rats, but out here, under an open sky with no reset buttons, they had one advantage the harvesters had never accounted for. Behind him, the warehouse door screeched open. Jax limped out, wiping blood from a split lip. "They're getting faster," he muttered, tossing Kael a cracked data pad. The screen showed their latest casualty count simulated this time. If those things adapt like the architect's models, Kael cut him off with a glance at the horizon. A single pinprick of light pulsed there, too rhythmic to be a star, then another and another. "They will," he said softly. The rifle's grip creaked under his fingers. But so do we. The first raindrops hit the pavement like distant gunfire. Somewhere in the city, a child laughed, oblivious. Kael didn't look away from the lights. Let them come. The grid had been a cage. This was the wild, and the hunted had just become hunters. The rain fell in sheets now, mixing with the sweat and grime on Kael's face as he stood before what remained of his team. The sky above pulsed with unnatural light, the harvesters' silhouettes warping the clouds as they descended like knives through silk. Around him, the others checked weapons, tightened armor straps, traded last-minute nods, no speeches needed. They all knew the odds. Kael wiped water from his eyes and grinned, the expression sharp enough to cut glass. "Funny thing about simulations," he said, tapping the stolen neural interface at his temple. The device glowed faintly, still humming with residual energy from the grid. "Turns out, if you survive enough of them, you start recognizing the patterns." He glanced at Jax, who was already loading a fresh power cell into his rifle with practiced ease. "This time, we control the simulation." A chorus of clicks echoed as safeties flipped off. The air vibrated with the harvesters' approach, their engines a bass note that shook the rubble beneath their boots. Somewhere in the distance, a building groaned and collapsed, its death scream drowned out by the rising whine of alien weapon systems charging. Kael didn't wait for the first shot. He raised his hand, and the city around them erupted not in destruction, but in rebellion. Streetlights flared to life, then overloaded in cascading bursts of sparks. Sewer grates exploded upward as jury-rigged EMP mines detonated beneath the harvesters' landing zones. The very infrastructure the invaders had ignored, the power grids, the water mains, the forgotten subway tunnels became weapons. Jax's laughter was a ragged, triumphant thing as the first harvester staggered, its limbs locking mid-stride as Lira's virus slithered through its systems. "Damn right," he shouted over the chaos, sighting down his scope. "Game on." The sky lit up with the first exchange of fire, tracer rounds and plasma bolts weaving a deadly tapestry overhead. Kael didn't flinch. He'd seen this moment 1,000 times in the grid, every possible outcome, every permutation of failure. But this was new, this was theirs. And as the harvesters learned the hard way, nothing was more dangerous than a glitch that refused to be erased.